They called it the future of railroading, a machine so powerful, so advanced, that it could pull more weight, climb steeper grades, and run faster than anything that had come before. But when the day finally came to unleash it, something happened that no one expected. The ground shook, the rails groaned, and then, with a sound like thunder, the tracks themselves began to break apart beneath its wheels. This is the true story of the train, so powerful, it shattered its own tracks, and why its legacy still haunts engineers to this day. Let's rewind to the 1930s and 40s. Steam power is king, but the railroads are desperate for something new. Freight loads are getting heavier, mountains are getting steeper, and the competition from trucks and planes is getting fierce. The answer: build bigger, build stronger, build a locomotive that can do the work of 5 engines all by itself. This was the era of the superpower steam locomotive. Every railroad wanted the biggest, the fastest, the most powerful engine on the rails. The Union Pacific Big Boy, the Pennsylvania Railroad S1, the Soviet AA20, the South African Garratts. These weren't just trains, they were rolling monuments to human ambition. And sometimes that ambition went too far. But why did these railroads keep pushing the limits? Why did they risk everything to build engines that were almost too big for the world around them? The answer is simple: competition. In the United States, the railroads were locked in a battle for supremacy. Whoever could move the most freight, the fastest, over the toughest terrain, would win. In Europe, the challenge was geography: mountains, tight curves, and steep grades. In Russia, it was distance: thousands of miles of track, often in brutal conditions. The only way to win was to build bigger engines, more wheels, bigger boilers, more horsepower. And for a while, it worked. The trains got longer, the speeds got higher, the records kept falling. But then the problems started. Let's start with one of the most infamous examples: the Pennsylvania Railroad S1. Built in 1939, the S1 was a streamlined Art Deco masterpiece, 140 feet long, with a 6-4-4-6 wheel arrangement and a boiler so massive it looked like a battleship on rails. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The S1 was so long it couldn't handle tight curves. But the real problem was its power. When the S1 opened up on a straightaway, it could hit speeds over 100 miles per hour. The force of its massive driving wheels, combined with its weight, put so much stress on the rails that the track would literally start to deform. The ties would shift, the spikes would pull loose, and in some cases, the rails themselves would crack under the pressure. The S1 was so powerful that it could outpace almost any other train on the rails, but it was also so heavy and so long that it was limited to just a few straight, specially reinforced routes. It spent most of its life on display at the 1939 New York World's Fair, more a symbol of ambition than a practical locomotive. Only one was ever built, and it was quietly retired after just a few years. But the S1 wasn't alone. In the American West, the Union Pacific was facing a different challenge: the Wasatch Mountains. The grades were steep, the trains were long, and the demand for freight was growing every year. The answer: the Big Boy. At 132 feet long and weighing over 1.2 million pounds, the Big Boy was the largest steam locomotive ever built for regular service. With a 4884 wheel arrangement, it was designed to haul mile-long freight trains over the mountains, without helpers, without stopping, and without mercy. But even the Big Boy had its limits. The sheer weight of the locomotive put enormous stress on the rails. The track had to be rebuilt and reinforced just to handle the load. Bridges were strengthened, curves were eased, and even then, the Big Boy could only run on certain routes. If it strayed onto lighter track, the rails would buckle under its weight. The Big Boy was a triumph of engineering, but it was also a warning. There's a limit to how much power the rails can handle. Go beyond it, and the tracks themselves start to fail. If the Big Boy was the king of the mountains, the Soviet AA20 was the monster of the steppe. Built in 1934, the AA20 was the largest steam locomotive ever constructed in the Soviet Union. With a 414 four-wheel arrangement, yes, 14 driving wheels, it was designed to haul massive freight trains across the flat Russian landscape. But the AA20 was too big for its own good. The engine was over 110 feet long, and weighed more than 1.1 million pounds. It was so heavy that it broke the track on its very first test run. The rails bent, the ties shifted, the ballast was crushed. The engine was simply too much for the infrastructure around it. Only one was ever built, and it was quickly retired and scrapped. The lesson was clear. There's a limit to how much power the rails can handle, and sometimes the only way to find that limit is to go too far. But it wasn't just the United States and the Soviet Union pushing the limits. In Africa, Australia, and India, engineers faced a different challenge: light track, tight curves, and heavy loads. The answer? The Garratt. Invented by British engineer Herbert Garratt, these articulated locomotives had two sets of driving wheels, one at each end, with the boiler suspended between them. The largest Garratts, like the South African Railways class GMAM, were over 100 feet long and weighed more than 250 tons. But the Garratts were so powerful that they often overwhelmed the tracks they ran on. In South Africa, the massive engines had to run at reduced speeds or risk tearing up the rails. In Australia, the tracks had to be constantly maintained and reinforced to handle the weight. The Garratts were kings of the wilderness, but they were always on the edge of disaster. But why did these trains break the tracks? Why did the most powerful engines in history end up destroying the very rails they were supposed to conquer? It comes down to physics. The heavier the locomotive, the more force it exerts on the rails. When you add speed, that force increases exponentially. Tracks are designed to flex and absorb some of that energy, but there's a breaking point, go beyond it, and the rails start to move, the ties shift, the ballast underneath gets crushed, and eventually something has to give. Engineers tried to solve the problem. They reinforced the tracks, they used heavier rail, they improved the design of the wheels and the suspension. But in the end, the solution wasn't to build bigger locomotives, it was to build smarter ones. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the age of the superpower steam locomotive was coming to an end. Diesel and electric power were on the rise. Instead of one massive engine, railroads started using multiple smaller locomotives distributed along the train. This spread out the weight, reduced the stress on the rails, and allowed for longer, heavier trains without destroying the track. But the legend of the train so powerful it shattered its own tracks lives on. The big boy, the S1, the Garratts, the AA20, these were machines that pushed the limits of what was possible. They were symbols of an era when bigger was always better, when power was the ultimate goal, and when the only way to find the limit was to go too far. Europe has its own stories of impossible trains. The Bernina Railway, climbing to 7,391 feet without rack and pinion assistance, was so steep and so exposed that engineers said it couldn't be done. The Pilatus Railway in Switzerland, with a maximum gradient of 48%, required inventing a completely new rack system just to keep the trains from sliding backward. In Italy, the Cinque Terre Railway was carved into cliffs above the Mediterranean, through rock so unstable that entire sections had to be rebuilt after landslides. In Norway, the Flåm Railway climbs nearly 3,000 feet in just 12 miles through avalanche zones and tunnels, spiraling inside the mountain. All of these routes required pushing the limits, not just of locomotives, but of the tracks themselves. Every time a new, more powerful engine was built, the tracks had to be reinforced. Every time a new route was carved through the mountains, the engineers had to invent new ways to keep the rails from shifting, the ties from rotting, the ballast from washing away. If you're enjoying this story of engineering gone wild, do me a favor and hit that like button right now, and subscribe because we've got more tales of railway giants, near disasters, and impossible engineering coming your way. Trust me, the next story is even crazier. So what's the legacy of these monster locomotives? In some ways, they were failures. They were too big, too heavy, too powerful for the world they were built to conquer. But in another way, they were a necessary step. They showed engineers where the limits were. They forced railroads to rethink how they built both trains and tracks. And they paved the way for the modern, efficient, and reliable railways we have today. Today, a few of these giants survive in museums. The Union Pacific Big Boy has even been restored to operating condition. thrilling crowds across America. But the days of building ever bigger steam engines are over. The lesson was learned the hard way. Sometimes more power isn't the answer. Sometimes the rails themselves get the last word. It's easy to marvel at the engineering, but it's important to remember the human cost. Building these impossible railways required thousands of workers, many of whom paid with their lives. The Gotthard Tunnel in Switzerland, the Semmering in Austria, the tunnels of the Flom and Bernina lines, these were built with hand tools, dynamite, and sheer determination. Accidents were common, working conditions were brutal, but the result was infrastructure that changed the world. The story of the train, so powerful it shattered its own tracks, is a story about ambition, about the desire to go further, faster, higher, heavier. It's about the willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something greater. And it's about the realization that sometimes the world pushes back. But it's also a story of progress. Every time a track was broken, every time a bridge was rebuilt, every time a locomotive was retired because it was too big, engineers learned something. They learned how to build better tracks, how to design smarter locomotives, how to balance power with practicality. Today's railways are the result of those lessons. Modern trains are faster, more efficient, and more reliable than ever before. Not because they're bigger, but because they're smarter. Distributed power, advanced materials, computer-aided design, all of these innovations are the legacy of the era when bigger was always better. So why do we still love these monster locomotives? Why do people travel across the world to see the big boy run, to visit the museums where the S1 and the Garratts are preserved, to ride the impossible railways of the Alps and the fjords? Because they represent something we all admire: the willingness to dream big, the courage to try the impossible, the understanding that failure is just a step on the way to success. These trains are more than machines. They're monuments to human ambition. So here's my question for you. If you could see one of these monster locomotives in action, which would it be? The big boy? The S1? The Russian AA20? Or one of the others? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look at the train so powerful it shattered its own tracks, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more railway legends, engineering marvels, and near misses coming your way. Until next time, remember, sometimes the only way to find the limit is to go too far.